So many would say that Ireland is on the cusp of an energy revolution, and I suppose given our location, there's huge potential for the country to develop offshore wind energy as a resource. And I suppose wind energy is at the heart of the government's climate action plan's ambition to cut CO2. So I suppose this evening's lecture is going to give us some context to the background of policy and legislation regarding the development of offshore wind energy. It will look at Ireland's position in relation to carbon reduction targets and climate action plan, and will explore some of the construction challenges involved in this, what is a very exciting area. So our speaker for this evening, well, he's no stranger to us here in the Northwest region. In fact, he actually chaired our region here back in, I think it was the late 90s. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Mr. David Kiely. David is a director and partner at Jennings O'Donovan Consulting Engineers based here in Sligo. David is a chartered civil and environmental engineer, and he has 39 years experience in the design and project management of large infrastructural and renewable energy projects. He's currently a council member of Wind Energy Ireland and is also on their Offshore Wind Committee and on their Floating Wind Committee as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our speaker for this evening, Mr. David Kiely.
Thank you, Rowan. Thanks to Engineers Ireland for inviting me to speak. And thank you all for taking the time out on this glorious evening here in Sligo to be with us and to be interested in the topic of onshore wind or offshore wind. Even. So just to start a little bit about Jennings O'Donovan and Partners. We've been around for over 70 years. We've been involved in onshore wind since the late 1990s. And we're currently involved in one offshore wind project where we're working as project supervisor design stage. And that's for the past 15 months or so. So our presentation this evening is going to cover an introduction, and we're going to talk about units and why onshore wind and offshore wind, but particularly offshore wind, the global EU, UK, and Irish perspective on offshore wind, the targets and policy related to offshore wind, planning and consenting, the electricity generation mix now and in 2050, the grid, where we're going to talk about air grids approach, 10E, the European supergrid, auctions, hydrogen and electrofuels, the supply chain, a typical development route, and some closing comments and indeed questions. So we're going to start for a little bit about units for people who might not be electrical or energy engineers. So the basic unit of power is a watt. And you might remember, especially if you had 39 years experience like I have, that the old light bulbs that we used were 60 watts or 100 watts. And nowadays, they're obviously replaced by LEDs at less than 10 watts. So then if you had 1,000 of, say, 100 of those bulbs, those 10-watt bulbs, you'd have a power demand of 1,000 watts, and that'd be a kilowatt. And then 1,000 kilowatts is a megawatt. And we generally measure turbine capacities in megawatts, and indeed wind farm capacities in megawatts. And then 1,000 of those, again, is a gigawatt. And that's the sort of scale of countries' outputs. And then beyond that, again, is terawatts. If you go back to, say, your electric kettle at home, that's about 1,500 watts or 1.5 kilowatts. And if you ran that for an hour, for example, you would use energy and you'd use 1.5 kilowatt hours of energy. So when we look at energy use, we generally talk in terawatt hours, which is 1 billion kilowatt hours. The old energy units, which we'd see in a lot of reports historically, were in kilotons of oil equivalent, but that's hopefully going to be phased out and replaced with the terawatt hours and whatever. So we just want to move on then to just giving you an idea of the size and scale of turbines. So a typical recently installed onshore turbine would be in the region of 3 to 4 megawatts. And a typical recently installed offshore turbine would be in the range of 6 to 8.8 megawatts. A typical planned onshore turbine will be in the range of 5 to 6 megawatts, and a typical planned offshore turbine will be in the range of 8 to 14 megawatts. And these are examples of some of those turbines which are now coming on the market, 14 megawatt from Siemens Gamesa and a 12 megawatt from GE. So the main producers and manufacturers of these turbines are MHI Vestas, which are Japanese, Danish, Siemens Gamesa, which are German, Spanish, GE Wind, which are US, and then some of these other names here, which are all Chinese. So you might ask, why offshore wind? Well, the scale of projects involved in offshore wind are so much bigger that you can deliver a lot more than you would in onshore wind. And as we'll see later, we need offshore wind to meet targets. There are generally higher unrestricted wind speeds at sea compared to land, where topography can cause reductions in speed and eddies and effects which lower the output. There are perceived reduced impacts on the public compared to onshore, such as noise and shadow flicker. And we're also able to use higher capacity turbines. So just looking ahead at the total global installations of onshore wind now. So we'll see that the Chinese are way ahead with 39% of the global market, followed by the US and Germany. And if we look at the figure in the middle there, 707.4 gigawatts, just remember that just for 1 second. And then we go on and we look at the total global installations of offshore wind, and we'll see the world leader is our neighbors, the United Kingdom, with China very close behind, and then Germany. And then looking at the figure in the middle again, it's 35.3. Comparing that to the 707, we see that it's about 1/20th of the onshore wind figure. Forecasts are difficult, but we look ahead to COP26 in November in Glasgow, and the aspiration that it will endorse a carbon neutral world by 2050. John Kerry, US climate envoy, quotes that it is the last best chance to get real in avoiding climate catastrophe. GWEC, which is the Global Wind Energy Council, bring out a comprehensive report each year, published in March, and they forecast that 180 gigawatts per year of wind that's combined onshore and offshore need to be installed to meet that 2050 carbon neutral target. Another forecast they have is that 70 gigawatts of offshore wind will be added in the period 2021 to 2025, plus 400 gigawatts of onshore wind. And these are based on pipelines and forecasts. Now, zoning in a little bit on the European context, that same GWEC report estimates that Europe needs to provide 450 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050 to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it also forecasts that Ireland's Atlantic zone can contribute 85 gigawatts. A European Commission document from December estimates that the offshore wind capacity, an offshore wind capacity of 300 gigawatts is required, together with ocean energy of 40 gigawatts by 2050 to meet climate neutrality. Looking at the UK, it's the global leader with 10.415 gigawatts installed at the end of 2020. they have a government target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. They also have a target of at least 1 gigawatt of floating wind by 2030. And there's actually debate on at present to increase that to 2 gigawatts. They have a target of 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030. In terms of onshore wind, they have 13.74 gigawatts installed. So you can see their offshore installation is rapidly catching up with onshore. They're unlikely to progress too much with onshore wind. They will happen, but not to the scale of offshore wind. And offshore wind will be the backbone of the UK's energy system by 2030. Now, if we focus in on Ireland, we have 25.2 megawatts installed. That's 7 turbines in the Arklow Bank phase 1. They were the biggest turbines of their time. No turbines installed since 2004. And you might ask why that is. So Foreshore's leases and licenses are granted under the Foreshore Act of 1933. Foreshore leases were granted for Arklow Bank in 2002 and for Codling 1 Bank wind farm in 2005. The foreshore leases, they're for installations in the sea, and licenses are typically for investigations in the sea. The leasing regime was typically for harbours, harbour extensions, pipelines like sea outfalls, sewage outfalls, cables, aquaculture installations. When these large projects started coming across their desk, they realized that the system in place just wasn't fit for these projects. So there's been a moratorium on consenting and foreshore leases for offshore wind projects since 2012. However, since that time, we've been building onshore wind, and we've built 4,255 megawatts. At the time of the moratorium, there were other applications in hand, such as Codling 2 Bank, Oriel, the Dublin Array Kish Bank, Dublin Array Bray Bank, and Skerda Rocks wind farm. Skerda Rocks is off the coast of Galway. The others are all east coast. And there's also a demonstration project with the department for license afloat, and I'm going to talk about that later. So looking at EU policy then that's going to drive things for us. Just a few weeks ago, 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets have been agreed in Europe, which is a reduction to 55% of 1990 levels. And that's in accordance with the Paris Agreement, or COP21. So the aim is to have detailed legislative proposals by June 2021. And in parallel with that, there's the European Green Deal set of policy initiatives, and that's been driven forward with the objective to make Europe carbon neutral in 2050, having an eye to the COP26, hopefully, agreement in Glasgow. And part of that European Green Deal includes a Just Transition Fund, which may help various countries with implementing green policy and green infrastructure. And this is an interesting map in that the red line there shows the extent of our marine territory, and that is 10 times our land mass. And now looking at our own carbon neutral aspirations, it is our ambition to have a low carbon economy by 2050. That was first mooted in Project Ireland 2040. It's also in the Climate Action Plan of 2019. That Climate Action Plan includes for 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and that 70% of our electricity will come from renewable energy by 2030. It's also enshrined in the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Bill. That's actually been debated in the last, it was debated at the end of last year and also went through the Dáil recently. And then in the programme for government, that sets even higher targets, 5 gigawatts for offshore wind to be installed by 2030. And there's a stated ambition for 30 gigawatts of floating wind energy off Ireland's south and west coast. It also encourages research in scientific and technological innovation and anything to do with the bioeconomy, marine sequestration, green hydrogen, wave, everything that can help us realise the immense potential of Ireland's offshore renewables. In terms of a planning system, we obviously have to replace the 1933 Foreshore Act and the legislation around that. So the first item is a national marine planning framework, and that's a statutory spatial plan. It's a long-term forward planning for the extensive maritime area, and that will stand as a parallel document to the national planning framework. You might remember that was launched in Sligo 3 years ago. The National Marine Planning Framework was passed in the Dáil only last week, 12th of May, culmination of 3 years in development and consultation. And as part of the process, we do have to submit that to the EU. Then there's the Maritime Area Planning Bill, which was known as the Maritime Planning and Development Management Bill. So legal drafting is ongoing, and it's hoped that it will be published sometime during this quarter and will be enacted by the end of 2021. That's a response to much needed reform of marine governance. It will underpin a new marine planning system and will replace the foreshore consent process. It will provide for designated marine area plans, and there's a new agency being set up, the Marine Area Regulatory Authority, or MARA. The key roles of MARA will be the granting of all maritime area consents for the maritime area, granting maritime licenses for specific scheduled activities, including environmental surveys, ensuring compliance and enforcement, and managing the existing state foreshore portfolio of leases and licenses. A transition protocol was published in 2020, and that was to deal with the 7 offshore wind projects that were in the process, should we say. So those relevant projects will be given a planning interest in the meaning of the bill. They'll apply to An Bord Pleanála for final development consent. And those projects are Oriel, the Bray and Kish Banks, Codling 1 and Codling 2, the Scared Rocks, and the North Irish Sea Array. So planning interest will allow those projects to continue environmental scoping exercises, continue site investigations and surveys, interact with EirGrid on grid connection studies, and allow them to prepare and finalize environmental reports to accompany planning application. So there is a process at the moment out for public consultation for expanding our network of marine protected areas. So those will be similar to special areas of conservation, special protection areas that people will be familiar with from the terrestrial environment. So the objective is to give vital protection to vulnerable marine species and habitats. There is an international agreed target of having a minimum of 10% of the marine area protected. And at the moment we have been members of OSPAR, and we have presently 2.13% of a marine area designated as marine protected areas. And the government aim, also under the National Development Plan and under the Programme for Government, is to expand Ireland's NPA from 2.13% to 30% of our maritime area by 2030. So just a little bit about foreshore investigation license applications. If a developer wants to do, say, site investigations in gravel banks or the seabed, they have to apply to the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine under the Foreshore Acts 1933 to 2011. And the Minister for State at the recent Wind Energy Conference said that over the last 2 years, his department has received in excess of 50 site investigation applications relating to offshore wind farm activity, with 24 having been received since September 2020 alone. So the department are undertaking to publish a list in the coming weeks, and they will deal with the applications chronologically. A lot of these are early stage sites and likely to have a fair degree of attrition. If you look up the department's site, this is the type of information that one would get, whether they're at consultation or they're applied for, and the status of them. So when one trawls through all those applications, one can get a sense as to the areas of interest for offshore wind development. This map is probably not 100% correct because there is no map. There is no comprehensive list, but it's what we can piece together. So we've color coded the various sites, red being for fixed bottom offshore wind farms, the black for floating, and the green for fixed or floating. So you'll notice there, for example, some of the earlier ones like the Arklow Bank, Codling, Dublin Array, Oriel, North Irish Sea Array, Scared Rocks, and then you'd have heard recently in the news about Moneypoint, ESB Equinor, with floating turbines here coming to Moneypoint, generating green hydrogen and going up or using electricity up the 400 kV motorways. So again, we've attempted to list the various projects. Again, I'm not saying this is comprehensive, but it's the best information that we have. And when we add all those up, the total comes to about 15,741 megawatts. So that's quite a bit of interest in our offshore wind space. Just a little bit about Arklow Bank Wind Farm Phase 2. That has a foreshore lease. It's 27 kilometers long by 2.5 kilometers wide. It was out for consultation, project development parts of it, in October and November of last year. So they will be submitting further applications under the foreshore lease requesting permission to construct their offshore infrastructure, such as their cables, their platforms, and their landfall structures. They'll also have to have separate planning applications for onshore infrastructure, such as the grid and substations, as strategic infrastructure development applications to onboard Cronulla. Just looking a little at floating wind, the current programme of government are the first to set a floating wind target. As I said earlier, Europe is targeting 450 gigawatts by 2050. Ireland has the potential to supply 85 gigawatts of this. So we should really contribute and fund more demo projects. But we currently have one project, 31 million budget, called Afloat, and that's being developed off the coast of Belmullet. It's an ambitious 4-year floating offshore project. It's to see how the floating wind turbine will react and survive in places that are greater than 50 meters of water. It's planned to be deployed during 2022. And it will really demonstrate how survivable and cost competitive a floating offshore wind turbine can be. It will raise awareness and provide confidence to investors regarding technology and investability. It will create a supportive policy environment and help to develop an awareness in the supply chain. Like I said, it'll be deployed in depths of over 50 meters, average wind resource of 10 meters a second, and extreme waves of over 30 meters. I'm now going to go on to energy and go through some energy usage facts, where we are now, where we'll be in the future, and then we'll go on to how we meet those energy targets in the future. So currently, renewables represent 11.2% of total primary energy requirement. Oil is the dominant supply at 49.3%, and natural gas at 31.3%. So that's on the one side. These come from the SEAI report, Energy in Ireland 2020. Every year in December, SEAI bring out a very comprehensive report, and it's more or less a year out of date when it's launched, but it takes that time to do all the analysis. So looking at how the energy is used up, it varies a little bit from year to year, but effectively transport heat and electricity are roughly a third. And the total energy is given in kilotons of oil equivalent. And if you convert that to the gigawatt hour figures, it'll be 169.8. So just moving on then, it's just represented a little bit differently here. And the total energy in the middle, the electricity, transport and heat, and then what goes in to make up those demands. So you'll see in electricity, for example, wind makes up 5.9% of that. And then renewables, for example, make up 2% of heat, and renewables 1.3% of transport. So we have binding targets for 2020, and I know 2020 is past, but it really will be the end of 2021 before we know whether we've achieved those targets or not. So the RES is renewable energy share, and these targets are in response to the Renewable Energy Directive, or RED directive. So for electricity, our target is 40% of our electricity to come from renewables. And in 2019, we were at 36.5. Now, Mark Foley, who's the head of EirGrid at the recent Wind Energy Ireland conference, has claimed that we have surpassed 40% during 2020. In terms of transport, again, our target was 10, and we were below that at 8.9. And in heat, our target was 12, and we're well below that at 6.3. Not much of a move in heat over the past few years. In overall terms, in 2019, we were at 12%, and in overall terms, our target was 16%. So still quite a bit behind. So I now want to just move on to the findings of a very recent report by Maritime and Wind Energy Ireland on our climate neutral future, 0 by 50. So again, this represents the inputs and the outputs in terms of energy. On the left-hand side, all of the various sources that we use for energy. And on the right-hand side, the primary energy demand and what they all go into. And down here, you'll see renewable energy, 12% of the total, and renewable energy, 37% of the total, and an import dependence of 70%. So looking ahead then to 2050, you'll see not much oil being used. Biomass and, say, anaerobic digestion and other such technologies, 38 terawatt hours. Wind, the dominant one, at 77 terawatt hours, and solar at 4 terawatt hours. And then you see how they all get used. What you do notice is that the total primary energy load is lower than it is at currently, because we'll be using energy much more efficiently. And if you look down to the bottom here, 100% renewable energy, 5% import dependence. And we'll see why maybe in a few minutes. So on this slide here, also from that same report, we have the electricity generation on the left-hand side. And we'll see that from in 2019, we can generate 30 terawatt hours of energy. That'll rise to 43 and ultimately to 84 as we transfer more heat and transport onto the system, as well as a population increase. When we look at the power system capacity to react to that predicted energy load, we see at the moment, at 2019, we have coal and peat, we have a certain amount of gas, we have wind, and we have interconnection at the top. And then looking at 2030, the same amount of gas, a significant increase in wind, solar also coming into the mix, other renewables coming into the mix, and then the interconnection, and also battery storage. And then looking ahead to 2050, there's some decarbonized gas coming in, which is effectively hydrogen or methane from anaerobic digestion. A lot more wind, going up to 21 gigawatts of wind, 4 gigawatts of solar, batteries, 3 gigawatts, and then, so that all adds up to 37 gigawatts. So the figure to remember here is that 21 gigawatts of wind generation. So looking ahead then, and if we allow 8 gigawatts for existing and future onshore wind, then we need 13 gigawatts of offshore wind installed capacity. A Wind Energy Ireland survey in Q1 of 2021 estimated 27 projects in the Irish offshore wind pipeline, which could deliver between 15 and 22 gigawatts of installed capacity. That ties up with the table that we had a little bit earlier. So if those future wind turbines offshore are installed at, say, 12 megawatts each, we'd need almost 1,100 of those to meet our 2050 targets. If we look at maybe one or two examples, going back to that SEAI report, the rail usage is 44 kilotons of oil equivalent. And if you do the calculations and bring it back to an hourly basis and you peak it a bit and allow for growth, it's about 300 megawatts that we're going to need. That could be served from a mix of wind, solar, biomass, and batteries. Alternatively, if you had 12 of those 12 megawatt offshore turbines, it could run our rail system. And one could use the track system to distribute electricity. if you look at our cars, there are 2.68 million vehicles in Ireland, of which 2.1 million are cars. AA says that cars do an average of 16,000 kilometers per annum. Cartail says slightly higher figure. And, 4 kilometers need a kilowatt of power. So when you do all those figures, you come down to 2025 megawatt hours of electricity or power energy needed for running 2.1 million cars. And if you look at offshore wind and using a 50% capacity factor, you need to double that. So you're going to need just over 4,000 megawatts. And if you have 12 megawatt turbines, you need 340 turbines to run your whole car fleet in the country. And at 2.5 million, that should be per megawatt, the costs would be 10.13 billion. So I'm just going to move on to grid connections. And this is hot off the press, literally. So a new offshore transmission system policy was approved by government last week. And they envisage a phased transition from the current decentralized offshore transmission system model to a centralized one over the course of this decade. And that's to take place in line with 3 offshore RES auctions. I will be talking about those in a few minutes. So the transmission system assets are to be planned, developed, owned and operated by EirGrid. That's in the longer term. But in the first phase, which is 2021 to 2024, and to coincide with the first RES auction, it's envisaged that the offshore renewable projects that are successful in that auction will develop their own associated offshore transmission system. And in the second phase, which is 2025 to 2030, and that will coincide with the second offshore RES auction, the planning and development may be carried out by either the renewable energy projects or by EirGrid. And in the third phase, which is 2030 onwards, to correspond with the third RES auction, the offshore transmission system will be exclusively developed by EirGrid, with maritime areas in which renewables deployment may take place to be provided for in the second offshore renewable energy development plan. So there's a new offshore renewable energy development plan to be developed, and you'll have these areas where offshore wind will be favored and EirGrid will provide the grid to those areas. And so the transmission assets are going to be owned by EirGrid. And that's regardless of whether the developer provides them or whether EirGrid themselves provide them. So if you're a short-term developer and consistent with existing onshore practice, the transmission system assets will be developed by the renewable energy projects, and they have to be in accordance with a functional spec that is provided by EirGrid. So when you get your grid connection offer, they tell you how it should be built, and you build it to that, and then it gets commissioned and taken over and operated by EirGrid, but owned by ESB networks. So currently, Ireland's transmission system is limiting the amount of renewable energy it can accept due to limited capability of the grid in certain parts of the country to transport the electricity. And so there's curtailment and constraints, and that limits renewables to 60% of demand to ensure system stability. So the aim is to get that up near 100% by 2030. It'll never get exactly to 100%, but 95% is probably a realistic target. So just moving on to EirGrid, they have a consultation document out at the moment called Shaping Our Electricity Future. And they're preparing it to find out how can they get 70% electricity from renewables on the grid by 2030. So we're currently nearing or maybe slightly over 40, and how can we get it up to 70%? So this is just a snapshot of our grid. We've got the two main motorways in red there, and then the next level down to 20 kV in blue, and then the darker grey ones there are 110 kV. You'll notice there's not that many motorways in the west or northwest of Ireland. 220 comes as far as Strana in Sligo and stops there. So the four approaches, the first one is a generation led. So they're saying put clean electricity generation close to where most power is used. So what they're saying here is, let's put all the effort into the East Coast and connect up as much offshore wind as we can. And in that scenario, they're looking at connecting 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind off the East Coast and a gigawatt of solar and inland wind farms. And they say they can deliver that, and it's highly likely to succeed. In the second scenario, it's a developer-led scenario, and it's ideally responding to where developers want the grid to be. And this is actually the essentially the mechanism that has got us to the 40%. So in this case, it would require a very large number of projects, and in the time frame that there is, EirGrid say this is highly unlikely to succeed. So it would be 4 gigawatts from inland wind farms and 2 gigawatts each from solar and offshore wind. So you can see the target there, the installation quantum for offshore wind has reduced from 4.5 in the previous to 2 in this scenario. If you look at the next scenario, technology led, they're talking about using high voltage direct current, power lines, buried ones, to move electricity across the country. And that requires 46 projects that they'll have to build. They're looking at 4 gigawatts from inland wind farms and 2 gigawatts each from solar and offshore wind. And they say that's very challenging to complete in the time. So again, that's similar to the last scenario, and that's 2 gigawatts from offshore wind. And the last scenario is a demand led, to put electricity users close to sources of clean energy. That might mean moving data centers to the west of Ireland or the northwest. It requires 41 projects, 4 gigawatts from inland wind farms, and 2 gigawatts each from solar and offshore wind. So really, under the EirGrid scenarios, it's between 2 gigawatts and 4.5 gigawatts that they're likely to be able to connect, depending on what model they use, which is probably going to be a hybrid of all of those four scenarios. Moving on to Europe again, back to Europe again. Any one of you, any roads engineers here will be used to the phrase 10T, which is Trans-European Networks for Transport. And, you know, the debate that is always in Ireland about having roads designated as core 10T or comprehensive 10T network. It's not just roads, it's all transport. There is a parallel approach in energy, and that has 9 priority corridors, and it had 3 priority thematic areas: smart grids, electricity highways, and cross-border captured CO2. So in December, the Commission adopted a proposal to revise the rules on 10E regulation and effectively that reflects the EU's enhanced climate and energy ambition. It includes offshore and hydrogen infrastructure, excluding natural gas and oil infrastructure, and looking at ways to shorten the permitting procedures for projects of common interest. So 10E will operationalize the EU strategy for offshore renewable energy. Interconnectors and hybrid offshore renewable energy transmission lines will be viewed as project of common interest. There will be 4 priority offshore grid corridors, a one-stop shop for permitting, not sure how that's going to work, and emphasis on regional cooperation for offshore renewable energy development. So this at the moment is still aspirational. When we look at the 4 corridors, we'll see that there are 2 that Ireland can fit into. Part of the country maybe in the North Sea's offshore grid area, but the rest of it in the southwestern offshore grid area. So I'm going to talk for a minute or 2 on superconductivity, and because when we get to the end of it, you'll see a link to the previous slide. So that's a phenomenon that occurs in some materials when cooled below a certain temperature, that unique characteristics arise, such as zero electrical resistance, high power density, low electromagnetic fields, all very important attributes in electricity transmission. So they are found in superconducting magnets and large scanners and all of that at the moment. And the Large Hadron Collider project has been used there. So again, in the context of, say, power generation, there are various studies and pilot projects underway at the moment in Germany and Korea. And it's a 2-node power system rather than a 4-node. And because of, you don't have to have the cables as far apart for heat losses and EMF, it means that you know, your rights of way can be tighter, and ultimately the cost is a lot lower. It's when we look at how a European supergrid might work, these are potentially the different nodes. The intention really is that using these superconductors, you'll be able to build a network like that. And at any one time, for example, at times of the year, the abundant hydro in Scandinavia can be transmitted down through Europe, or in summer, the abundant solar energy can be transmitted from Southern Europe, or at any time, the abundant wind energy in Western Europe can be transmitted to make up the electricity demand within Europe. Superconductors are also being used in turbine development and will enable bigger turbines, as in greater output. And GE are working on a prototype that should be available late next year or mid next year. Also on the platforms that exist for collecting the cables from all the different clusters of offshore wind turbines. There hasn't been a 2 gigawatt platform built yet, but if it was built, it would be a huge structure. But using supernode technology, the aspiration is that these platforms will be much, much smaller. So that means much less cost. So that will also give huge advantages to the offshore wind energy industry. We've spoken a little bit about auctions, and we have a renewable energy support system, which was published in July 2018. That replaced the refit program that we used to have. And it really is a system for underpinning the the price of electricity. So basically, the developer bids in a price on a megawatt hour basis and is guaranteed that price effectively. So the first auction was held in 2020 for onshore projects, and the offshore one is going to be called ORES, or offshore res. That will be open for applications in Q2 of 2022. It will be the subject of a state aid application to the European Commission. The detailed design is underway. Consultants are being appointed. Some of the design issues in relation to an auction will be the volume and the price cap. If we go back to the very new policy document on connecting offshore wind, it references three auctions, two between now and 2030. So if that's the case, they probably will be very high volume, but who's to say that may change? What the eligibility rules would be, obviously you need planning, permission, foreshore, lease, or the new consent that will arise. Has to be compatible with a single energy market. At the moment, you can bid into the single energy market on a day-ahead basis. Not known if there will be compensation for constraints and curtailment. How will the prices and clearing mechanism work? Is it a megawatt hour basis for the bid? Will it be subject to indexation? What are the settlement rules? Will there be bid bonds and performance securities? Will they allow multiple bids for varying capacities on the same project? So what that means is, if you have, for example, a foreshore lease for 900 megawatts, so you might want to bid in one project of 900 megawatts, or you might decide you're going to split it and put into a 450, or one of 600 and one of 300. So, those sort of options. So when we spoke about grid, we spoke about the constraints that arise, and EirGrid perhaps, having a challenge to deliver what's needed by 2030 and possibly beyond. Another route to market that's perceived is green hydrogen. And the green is the hydrogen that's generated from renewables. Basically, you take renewable electricity, you put it into, use water to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So you harness the hydrogen and the oxygen is a byproduct. So it's often referred to as power to X. So hydrogen like power to gas, which is hydrogen gas more often than not. And you can use hydrogen gas for fuel for transport, and there are some projects underway with that. For example, in the Orkney Islands, there's hydrogen has been used for several years now to transport ferries, and in Long Mountain in Antrim, Energia are currently installing a hydrogen plant, and they have an arrangement with TransLink NI to fuel 3 double-decker buses in the future. So that's a project that's being developed at the moment. Then there's power to chemicals, such as using hydrogen to make ammonia or methanol. And ammonia is seen as, believe it or not, a fuel for ocean ships and liners and large transport ships. Then there is power to liquid fuels, where you take hydrogen and you combine it with captured CO2 to create a biofuel, something similar to oil. So that's the sort of range of projects that are currently under research and prototype, and beyond prototype in some cases. So there's 50 gigawatts of green hydrogen projects announced in 2020, out of 80 gigawatts in the global pipeline. And there's also a European hydrogen backbone initiative for a network of 39,700 kilometers by 2040. So one can inject hydrogen into the normal gas grid. At the moment, it's been done where it's been trialed at very low percentages, like maybe 2 to 5%. It's hoped that it will go to 15 to 20%, and ultimately that the fossil fuel gas will be replaced by gas generated from anaerobic digestion, or it may ultimately get to an all hydrogen network. So that's just a schematic. Desalinated seawater through an electrolyzer, and then generating hydrogen for transport, for industry, or the gas grid. Just a little bit about the supply chain. So we have potential, but in order to maximize value to this country, we need to develop a supply chain. So we need strategic investment into one or more Irish ports. There is significant investment going into Rosslare. All the ports, Dublin Port, Ringaskiddy as well, Foynes, there's interest in Galway also. And Belfast have also been developing a huge area for offshore wind. So there's the potential to develop offshore wind enterprise hubs around these ports and developing offshore wind clusters around these port hubs. So the skill shortage needs to be addressed. Enterprise Ireland are doing good work in that regard. So they have a network of 55 Irish companies to supply goods and services to offshore wind, and trying to get them involved in the UK industry so that those skills can then be taken back and replicated in Ireland. Just a little bit about the development journey timeframes. The studies in EIAR and all of that consenting process can take 5 to 7 years. Then the various investigations, grid connection application, procurement, and auction is another 2 to 3 years typically. Then pre-construction, whereby you've got to post-auction, get all your bids, your contracts signed, get the financial close, get your finance in place. And then 2 years, 2 seasons really of construction, followed by commissioning. So it's quite a journey in terms of time. And then if you look at the costs, the various studies in EIAR and consenting, anything up to 15 million, depending on the amount of geophysical surveys and site investigations that you do. And then pre-development to res, you will have to have a grid connection offer by that time. That could be 60 to 80 million for a typical, say, 500 megawatt offshore wind farm. And then taking that to financial close and design, you might have to secure and place orders on one of these big ocean going vessels that you need to book a year or so in advance to come and build your wind farm. So that'll take another 100 million. And the construction itself, about another billion. So you're looking at about 1.2 billion-ish for a 500 megawatt offshore wind farm, which is, a significant cost. So the development journey follows various packages, such as a development package, a transmission system package, a marine package, and a turbine package. And the development would address things such as overall scope and management, land for the onshore bits, foreshore licenses, planning applications. And then the transmission system deals with the offshore interturbine array, the export cables, the landfall, the onshore cables, the substation, which could be 220 kV upwards. And then when you're building things in the sea, the fixed ones are either monopiles or jackets. And then ultimately we'll be looking at various combinations of floating and various arrangement for floating. And the marine package will address how we're going to build those substructures and their concept design and ground investigations, geotechnical interpretive models, wind development, wind measurement LiDAR, wave buoy deployments, met-ocean device deployments, sediment dynamic assessments. There's a lot of studies. On a turbine package, you'd probably look at 4 to 6 turbine models, might have to look at some of those Chinese ones and develop employers' requirements and then go to the market and procure them. So I've now come to closing comments and questions. And sorry, they were meant to fly in there. Let me just see. I've lost them, but I'll go back to my comments anyway. So the first comment was, if we can achieve last viewed. Right. If we can achieve a global target to be carbon neutral by 2050, the demand for fossil fuels will expire. And that has huge geopolitical implications. Imagine, Middle East will be different. The American fleet won't have to be in the Gulf. If, for example, the gas pipeline, if it gets shut off by Putin, won't be a worry anymore. Sorry, need to go back again. So we can achieve we can be carbon neutral by 2050, but we do need offshore wind to achieve that target. We see the gap that's there. We need that 13 gigawatts of offshore wind. So the question for Ireland is, do we just build what we need, that 13 gigawatts of offshore wind? Or do we develop further within our maritime area to say 85 gigawatts, the EU contribution? Can offshore wind be the equivalent of Ireland's North Sea oil? How do we derive economic benefit for all citizens? So essentially, offshore wind, is it a potential game changer for Ireland? That's it. That's my presentation. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Very interesting, very thought-provoking, a lot to digest there. So I tell you, we have a few questions already on the Q&A, so I might go straight to them if that's okay. Okay, so I think the first question here, as far as climate change is concerned, can we say that the island of Ireland is well positioned to offer potential for an increase in offshore generation capacity? And further to that, is the current infrastructure suitable for such a potential increase?
We're certainly well placed to be able to install everything we need to combat climate change and to address our climate change targets. But at the moment, our infrastructure, our grid infrastructure is very limited and very poor. And that's why EirGrid have the consultation document out at the moment called Shaping Our Electricity Future. So they will aim over the next 10 years to address the 70% renewables, in electricity target, but they're not necessarily addressing the government target of 5 gigawatts by 2030. We saw in the various scenarios there, they come close in one of the scenarios at 4.5, but most of the other scenarios, they're at 2 gigawatts. So it takes so long to plan and build infrastructure in this country that my own view is we should be looking at 2050 and seeing what we need for 2050 and planning that now in parallel with the 2030 infrastructure. Because, like I say, it just takes so long. And if we don't do it now, and if we don't know what we're doing, we can't plan for it properly.
Yeah, very good. John has a question. And sorry, just a quick reminder, folks, just to make sure that you're putting your questions into the Q&A, not the chat function, if that's okay. John has a question. Will battery capacity be included in the design construction of offshore wind farms?
I'm not sure if they will be included in a typical offshore wind farm or not. I would imagine it's easier to put them on the onshore or near the onshore substation that a developer would build, where he connects his basically offshore cables to the grid system, to the terrestrial grid system. So to me, that would be the ideal place. But again, it's probably something that will develop over time.
Okay, thanks. Tidal has a question. Transmission grid assets will be owned by EirGrid even if they are provided by the developer. How will the developer be reimbursed for spending for something that will not belong to them ultimately?
Yeah, that's the way it is currently. The developer pays for the cost of the grid. Currently, a developer for an onshore project can apply for a grid connection on a contestable basis, which means he'll build it, or a non-contestable basis, which means either EirGrid or ESB networks will build it depending on the voltage. So at auction time, you know, it's a level playing field going into the auction. It'll be included in the price. So it'll be included in their financial model, and it will be operated. The transmission system will be operated by EirGrid, who's the transmission system operator, and will all be owned by ESB Networks, who's the asset owner of the transmission system. So ultimately, after 2030, EirGrid will build the transmission system, and they will charge the users for it. So again, it'll go into the developer's financial model, but under a different heading.
Very good. Donald has a question here. That we showed a large floating wind farm off the south coast and a test site off the northwest. Is there proven technology here, or are we still at pilot stage for different types like semi-submersible, the Spar Buoy, and others?
Yeah, there has been some installations off Portugal and off France, and you know, they've been very encouraging. So we are all looking forward to the one off Belmullet. I think there's the floating technology is developing in leaps and bounds, and what's available, for example, at the moment will shortly be replaced by, you know, in a year's time with something that's even more fit for purpose. So it is very emergent. Probably in an Irish context, we won't see full-scale floating offshore wind farms until post 2030.
Okay, very good. Charles has a question in relation to storage. What is the national position for energy storage? Sometimes we have very little wind. Where will the battery storage discussed be located?
Yeah, there is a DS3 program being implemented by EirGrid at the moment for battery storage projects. We're involved in 2 of them, each at 100 megawatts that have just been developed in County Offaly. So they're all near key nodes on the grid. So typically, for example, in those 2, they're the sites of former power stations that would be decommissioned, you know, former peat burning power stations. So there are quite a few bigger wind farms that are going to construction that incorporate battery storage as well. So, but effectively, you need them on where the grid is fairly strong. They're not of much benefit where the grid is weak. But the current program was for something like 600 to 800 megawatts of battery storage. We can see that increasing to something like 3,000, I think it was, on the Maritime slide between now and 2050.
Yeah, there's a follow-on question there from Charles as well. What is the technology used by EirGrid for transmission from offshore turbines to onshore? Will this be DC or some other technology? And he notes that the proposed Shetland wind turbines are proposing to use DC technology.
Yeah, they will be DC. Typically from the offshore will be to onshore will be DC.
Okay. And Kevin is asking, why is the expected solar PV element so small?
It's just that our if we look at capacity, for example. So if we look at wind, right, we install, for example, 1,000 megawatts of wind, and that wind farm would operate at times at full production, other times it wouldn't operate at all when there's no wind, and at other times it would be at part load. So over the course of a year, it would operate at an average basis of, maybe in the 30% of full capacity. So that's what we would call the capacity factor. So on offshore wind, that's higher. That's 45%, maybe going up to 55%, and possibly there's an aspiration for 60%. When we look at solar and we look at, say, solar PV, unfortunately in Ireland, we're down at a capacity factor of 9 or 10%. So, and the solar irradiance is best really along the south of Ireland and maybe on the east coast and part of the north east as well. So we just don't, we just don't have the extent of solar needed to install much more than 4 gigawatts.
A compliment from Divyam. A lot of very interesting information, and he's just asking, is the presentation recorded? And just to confirm that it is, and it will be available on the Engineers Ireland YouTube channel, and probably from tomorrow. Daniel is asking, excellent presentation, David. What is your recommendation to EirGrid in relation to the grid needs of the Northwest? Obviously, you had a map shown earlier on where we look like we're the poor relation in terms of motorways.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in onshore wind in the Northwest and West generally. And our recommendation really would be to EirGrid to look at providing some of those DC links across the country in the short term. There's also an initiative going on to generate hydrogen in the west of Ireland. There's an active project in development at the moment. So that hopefully will give another outlet. So I think over, and in the context of the gas pipeline, that project would be very proximate to the gas pipeline as well. So I think, we just need to look at hydrogen development as well as grid development and trying to move everything along at the same time.
Question from Ben there in relation to the availability of critical metals. Is that a potential issue for the industry?
It is, because of the aluminium in particular that go into a lot of electrical cables at the moment. So hopefully superconductors may reduce the quantum of metals that are required to and will transmit greater loads of electricity, on a ton per ton basis. So again, as I said earlier, the super node type of superconductor materials, there are projects in Munich and in Korea that are looking at how they behave, and again, it'll take a little bit of time, perhaps after 2030, before they'll be in widespread use. But it does offer the opportunity, should they be successful, to grow the scale of the industry even to where we want it to be by 2050.
Divyam has another question there. Do you think the Irish government will, sorry, this is in relation to the kind of the training and upskilling that you mentioned. Do you think the Irish government will launch courses in this industry where, for example, an electrical engineer can specialise in wind?
There is an emphasis for I know from, say, Letterkenny Institute of Technology, Sligo Institute of Technology, looking at all of that area. They're soon, hopefully, to become a technological university. So that will be a core of that technological university, is to have courses to respond to the opportunity that's off our West Coast. Wind Energy Ireland do a lot of SkillNet courses themselves. And while these are like short-term courses, they do help. And you know, it's like, say, for electricians, for example, who want to convert to working offshore and things like that, or working on turbines. And so there is a lot of training around that at the moment. But it is something that needs to be developed further, and it is something that I think can avail of you know, the Just Transition Fund and funding to develop courses.
Good. A colleague here in the Northwest region, John Gorman, is asking, given the very significant challenges in achieving the 2050 neutral target, how critical is the political will to achieve this based on past performances?
It's absolutely essential, because, you know, far be it to me to criticize any government, but we've made very little progress in getting a new planning system, for example, in offshore wind. We're 9 years since the moratorium. And I think, you know, if the political will was there, we would have dealt with that issue much earlier.
Okay. Ivan is looking for an insight into the market here, David. It's a very interesting presentation. What does David see as the top 3 opportunities for Irish companies to get involved in the offshore wind supply chain, given the established incumbent players in the global market?
Yeah, I think, you know, we're not going to be able to supply turbines. Okay. We're not going to be able to erect them. It's very, very big companies with global scale operations and huge ships that are going to do that. So on the electrical side, there is opportunity, such as the you know, electrical connections, getting the stuff, you know, the offshore platforms, the electrical work within those, supplying control equipment into those, the onshore grid connections. That I think that presents probably the biggest opportunity for Indigenous companies, is where it comes to shore, becomes AC again. It goes into the substations, built into substations. You know, I think that's huge opportunity.
Yeah, and maybe kind of a follow-on. There's a question from Pavel there. What role would you like to see GOD play in the offshore industry in the coming years?
Yeah, at the moment we're exploring niche areas. So project supervisor, design processes are one of our current roles. Also, we get involved in a lot of grid connection designs and project management. So again, the onshore bits of connecting offshore is probably an area we want to target.
And another interesting question here is in relation to the European context. Portugal, Spain, and France are also situated on the western seaboard of Europe. Have those countries got similar ambitions to Ireland in respect of offshore wind? And if so, what impacts might this have on our own ambitions?
They have ambitions. We're not sure quite what they are, but Norway, obviously the UK, Scotland, ourselves, yeah, Spain and Portugal would be the next. Not as good as say the northern part of Europe, but certainly has potential.
Good. Liam is asking, is tidal energy something that will be progressed in the future?
Tidal energy, one needs quite unique sites where there is a gap, such as, you know, Belfast or somewhere like that. Whereas, so I don't see much scope for tidal, but I do see scope for wave. And while wave is very costly to develop and is still very much at prototype stage, I would see that if you have, say, hybrid installations with, say, floating wind and wave as well, that they can coexist side by side at certain sites.
Charles is asking here, I suppose it's just in relation to COVID times and the way the world might change. But if a significant number of people sort of move out of cities and are working more remotely, let's say on the West Coast or Northwest, is anyone looking at the assumption that cities will really be the core of energy consumption? I suppose that's probably looking very far down the road.
Not sure how to answer that question.
What are the current thoughts, again, to go back to the supply chain, current thoughts on the development of a strong local supply chain to support offshore wind opportunity into the long term? I think you kind of touched on it already, David.
Yeah, and I mean, like the ports are all very active in developing themselves and what facilities they need. And it's not just the deep water part of it and being able to berth the ships. It's also the craneage and the laydown areas, because these are huge blades and huge sections, and the piles as well, and that the monopiles that need to be driven into the seabed. So there's a lot of hardware that need to be delivered and stored temporarily and then deployed as needed. Like, for example, if you have one of those big ships, installation ships, booked for a summer, or the few months of spring, late spring, summer into early autumn, you want all your materials on that wharf, on that quayside before you have that ship over. So the storage is a big requirement.
Okay, I think we have our last question here then. It's from Michael, and thanks a million for the presentation. He said, building on one of the earlier questions again about future skill sets, with offshore developments coming up, do you see an increased demand for Irish-based hydrographic surveyors?
Absolutely.
And sorry, one final one creeping in here. Just a comment in relation to Kiley begs that it has strong potential for supporting floating offshore wind.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. That's great, David. Listen, there's a lot of comments coming in here in relation to your appreciation for your talk. So I think we might we'll bring the Q&A to a conclusion there, if that's okay.
Thank you.
So look, David, just to say, thank you again